"Andrew, this table is for family. You can find a spot outside." My nephew laughed as the others grinned. The waiter dropped a $4,500 bill in front of me. I took a sip of my tea and chuckled. They had no idea who was covering it tonight. I, 42M, had been looking forward to this family dinner for weeks, though perhaps not for the reasons everyone else was. My sister had organized what she called a grand family reunion at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, the kind of place where appetizers cost more than most people's weekly groceries. The irony wasn't lost on me that she'd chosen a venue she couldn't afford, but then again, my sister had always lived beyond her means. The reservation was under my name, something I'd insisted on when she'd called asking for help with the booking. She'd hemmed and hawed about how difficult it was to get a table, how she'd tried for months, and finally asked if I could use my connections. What she didn't know was that I owned a significant stake in the restaurant group. What she also didn't know was that tonight would be the last time she'd take advantage of my generosity. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a simple but well-tailored suit. The maitre d' greeted me with the deference reserved for VIP guests, though I'd instructed him beforehand to treat me like any other customer in front of my family. I wanted to observe their behavior when they thought I was just regular old Andrew, the family member they'd always seen as successful but not wealthy, reliable but not remarkable. The private dining room was already buzzing with conversation when I entered. 23 family members had gathered, siblings, cousins, nephews, nieces, and their various partners. The table was set with the restaurant's finest china and crystal, and I noticed they'd already ordered several bottles of the most expensive wine on the menu. My sister caught my eye and waved me over with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. As I approached the table, my nephew Marcus, my sister's eldest at 26, looked up from his conversation and smirked. He gestured toward the beautifully set table where every seat was occupied except for a small side table near the window that had clearly been set up as an afterthought. Marcus announced loudly that the main table was for family, and I could find a spot outside. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because of their cruelty, but because of how casually they were delivered. Several family members laughed, including my sister, who quickly looked away when our eyes met. My brother-in-law raised his wine glass in a mock toast, and even some of the younger cousins giggled. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. These were people I'd helped countless times over the years. I'd paid for Marcus's college tuition when my sister couldn't afford it. I'd covered my brother's mortgage payments when he was between jobs. I'd quietly settled my cousin's gambling debts to keep him out of trouble. I'd been the family's safety net for over 2 decades, and this was how they saw me, someone to be tolerated and dismissed. The waiter approached nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He whispered an apology and gestured toward the side table, explaining that it was the best they could do given the circumstances. I nodded and walked over to the smaller table, pulling out my phone as I sat down. From my vantage point, I could observe the entire family gathering. They were animated and loud, ordering dish after dish from the most expensive sections of the menu. I watched my sister order the chef's tasting menu for the entire table, a 7-course experience that cost $300 per person. My nephew Marcus was particularly enthusiastic about the wine selection, calling over the sommelier to recommend pairings for each course. I sipped my tea and made a few discreet phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, confirming some documents I'd need for Monday. The second was to my accountant, discussing some changes to my will that I'd been contemplating. The third was to the restaurant manager, giving him specific instructions for the evening's service. As the evening progressed, the family's behavior became increasingly boisterous. They were clearly enjoying themselves, taking photos with the expensive food, posting on social media about their lavish dinner. My sister kept glancing over at me, and I could see a flicker of guilt in her expression, but she made no move to invite me to join them. The courses kept coming: Wagyu beef, fresh lobster, truffle-infused dishes that cost more per bite than most people spent on entire meals. The wine flowed freely, with bottles being opened faster than they could be consumed. I calculated the running total in my head, watching the bill climb higher and higher. Around the 4th course, my nephew Marcus stood up and made a toast. He thanked everyone for coming to celebrate family, talked about how important it was to stick together, and made a joke about how some people just didn't understand what family meant. The barb was clearly directed at me, sitting alone at my side table, and the laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. That's when I made my decision. I pulled out my phone and sent a text message to the restaurant manager, confirming the arrangements I'd made earlier. Then I sat back and continued sipping my tea, watching my family enjoy what they assumed would be a free meal. The seventh and final course was an elaborate dessert presentation, individual chocolate soufflés with gold leaf and rare berries. The family was in high spirits, already planning their next gathering, discussing who would host and where they might go. My sister mentioned how wonderful it was that they could all afford such nice things now, and how they should make these expensive dinners a regular tradition. As the last plates were cleared away, the waiter approached the main table with a leather portfolio. The conversation gradually died down as he placed it in front of my sister. She opened it with a confident smile that quickly faded as she saw the total. $4,500. The silence that followed was deafening. My sister's face went pale as she stared at the numbers. She looked around the table desperately, as if hoping someone would volunteer to help with the astronomical bill. My brother-in-law grabbed the check and his eyes widened. Marcus, who had been so confident earlier, suddenly looked very young and very worried. My sister's voice was shaky as she asked the waiter if there had been some mistake. He politely explained that everything had been ordered and consumed, and the prices were clearly marked on the menu. The wine alone had cost over $1,500. That's when all eyes turned to me. I was still sitting at my side table, calmly sipping my tea, watching the panic spread across their faces. My sister approached me hesitantly. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She asked quietly if I might be able to help with the bill, explaining that she hadn't realized how expensive everything would be. I looked at her for a long moment, then at the rest of the family who were all watching our interaction with desperate hope. These were the same people who had laughed when I was banished to the side table, who had made jokes about my not understanding family, who had treated me like an outsider at a gathering I had made possible. I chuckled softly and took another sip of my tea. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. Then I stood up and walked over to the main table where the check still lay open, the numbers seeming to grow larger in the dim light. I picked up the leather portfolio and examined the bill carefully, noting every expensive wine, every premium dish, every indulgent extra they had ordered without a second thought. The family watched me in complete silence, their earlier joviality replaced by mounting dread. Then I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my credit card. Not just any credit card, but the black card that marked me as one of the restaurant's most valued customers. I placed it on top of the bill and signaled to the waiter. The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. My sister actually started crying, thanking me profusely for saving them from what would have been a financial disaster. Marcus looked sheepish and mumbled something that might have been an apology. The rest of the family began talking all at once, their voices overlapping in a chorus of gratitude and nervous laughter. But I wasn't finished. As the waiter processed my payment, I asked him to bring me the microphone they used for special announcements. The family looked puzzled but pleased, probably expecting me to make some gracious speech about the importance of family and forgiveness. Instead, I began to speak about the evening's events. I described how I had been relegated to a side table, treated as less than family by the very people I had supported for years. I talked about the casual cruelty of their laughter, the dismissive way they had treated me, and the assumption that I would simply absorb their disrespect and pay their bills regardless. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence was different, heavy with shame and growing understanding. I continued speaking, my voice calm but firm, explaining that this dinner had been a test of sorts. I had wanted to see how they would treat me when they thought I had no power, no influence, no ability to affect their lives. They had failed that test spectacularly. I explained that while I was covering tonight's bill, it would be the last time I would bail any of them out of their financial irresponsibility. The college tuitions, mortgage payments, debt settlements, and emergency loans, all of that was ending tonight. They had shown me exactly how much my generosity meant to them, and I had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between family and people who simply share your DNA. The waiter returned with my credit card and receipt. I signed it, added a generous tip for the staff who had been caught in the middle of our family drama, and stood to leave. The silence in the room was absolute now, broken only by the soft sound of my sister crying. As I walked toward the door, my nephew Marcus finally found his voice. He called out an apology, saying they hadn't meant it, that it was just a joke, that they were family and family forgave each other. I paused at the doorway and turned back to look at them all one final time. I told them that family doesn't humiliate each other for entertainment. Family doesn't exclude and then expect generosity. Family doesn't take advantage of love and call it tradition. What they had shown me tonight wasn't family behavior. It was the behavior of people who had confused kindness with weakness and generosity with obligation. I left them sitting in that expensive restaurant, surrounded by the remnants of their $4,000 meal, finally understanding the true cost of their cruelty. The ride home was quiet, but for the first time in years, I felt genuinely at peace with my decision. Update 1. The aftermath of that dinner played out exactly as I had expected. Within a week, I received a flurry of phone calls and text messages from various family members. My sister called first, alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations. She couldn't understand how I could be so vindictive over what she called a harmless joke. When I reminded her that she had laughed along with everyone else, she claimed she was just trying to keep the peace. Marcus sent a long text message explaining that he had been drinking and didn't mean what he said. He asked if we could meet for coffee to talk things through, promising he had learned his lesson. I didn't respond. My brother-in-law tried a different approach, calling to discuss family investments and business opportunities, as if nothing had happened. When I made it clear that our financial relationship was permanently severed, he became hostile, accusing me of holding grudges and being petty. The most interesting response came from my youngest cousin, who had been at the dinner but hadn't participated in the initial humiliation. She called to apologize not just for that night, but for years of taking my help for granted. She was the only one who seemed to understand that the issue wasn't about money. It was about respect and basic human decency. I changed my phone number and had my lawyer send formal letters to family members who had outstanding loans from me. The letters explained that while I wouldn't demand immediate repayment, no additional financial assistance would be provided under any circumstances. Several family members tried to reach me through mutual friends and distant relatives, but I had made my decision. Update 2. 6 months later, the consequences of my decision had rippled through the family in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My sister's financial situation deteriorated rapidly without my safety net. She had been living beyond her means for years, counting on my periodic bailouts to maintain her lifestyle. When those stopped coming, she was forced to downsize her house and take on additional work. Marcus dropped out of graduate school when he couldn't secure additional funding. He had been counting on me to cover the costs, just as I had paid for his undergraduate degree. He found a job in retail and moved back in with his parents, a humbling experience that seemed to genuinely change his perspective. My brother lost his house when he couldn't make the mortgage payments. He had been relying on my help for over 3 years, and without it, foreclosure was inevitable. He and his family moved into a smaller apartment, and he was forced to take a second job to make ends meet. The family gatherings continued without me, but according to my youngest cousin, they were smaller, quieter affairs. The expensive restaurants and elaborate celebrations were replaced by potluck dinners and backyard barbecues. Some family members blamed me for the change in circumstances, while others began to understand the extent to which they had been dependent on my generosity. I used the money I would have spent on family bailouts to establish a scholarship fund for students from low-income families. It felt good to help people who truly needed assistance and who appreciated the opportunity rather than expecting it as their due. Update 3. A year after the dinner, I received an unexpected visitor. My sister appeared at my door on a rainy Tuesday evening, looking older and more tired than I remembered. She didn't ask to come in, didn't demand anything, didn't make excuses. She simply stood on my doorstep and apologized. She told me she had spent the past year thinking about that night and about our relationship over the years. She had come to understand that she had treated me not as a brother, but as a resource to be exploited. She acknowledged that the dinner incident was just the culmination of years of taking advantage of my kindness and mistaking my generosity for weakness. She didn't ask for money or help. She didn't suggest we rebuild our relationship or pretend things could go back to the way they were. She simply wanted me to know that she understood what she had lost and why she had lost it. I listened to her speak, noting the genuine remorse in her voice and the way she took full responsibility for her actions. When she finished, I thanked her for coming and for her honesty. I told her that while I appreciated her apology, some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. She nodded, understanding that this was likely the last conversation we would ever have. As she walked away, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The family I had thought I was protecting and supporting had never really existed. What I had been sustaining was a system of dependence and entitlement that had ultimately diminished all of us. The restaurant where that fateful dinner took place still sends me VIP invitations to special events. I go occasionally, always alone, and I enjoy the excellent food and impeccable service. Sometimes I think about that night and wonder if I could have handled things differently, but I always come to the same conclusion. That $4,000 dinner was the best money I ever spent, because it bought me something invaluable: the truth about the people I had called family, and the freedom to build a life based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The waiter who dropped that bill in front of my sister had no idea he was delivering my liberation along with the check.